translation as a means of describing the process of indigenization. Neither of them directly engage post-colonial studies, although some of their work does challenge post-colonial assumptions. It may be helpful to think of Christian Zionism as a byproduct of the process described by Sane and Walls as translation and indigenization. How then does the study of Christian Zionism problematize the approach adopted by CIGI? Were the Protestant carriers of Christian Zionism primarily concerned with the expansion of imperial power, or, as Walls and Sane would suggest, with the indigenization of the Christian message into the cultures they encountered? The English scholar Andrew Croom's work on the role that Jewish restorationism played in shaping British national identity is helpful here, I think, when thinking about post-colonial thinking. I'm going to quote from my recent book, A Short History of Christian Zionism, when he writes the following of 19th century English restorationists. A criticism made of these restorationists is that their efforts were imperialistic, which would fit into the CIGI paradigm, aimed at benefiting England and its wider empire. They clearly believed that aiding Jewish restoration would benefit England as it fulfilled its designated prophetic role. But this benefit would not be primary because they believed that Jewish restoration would lead to a diminishment of the British Empire, which would be eclipsed by the restored Israel. The Christian Zionist goal was not to secure the British Empire, but to establish the Jewish one. He writes, Palestine was Israel's land, not England's, and English rule in Jerusalem was ultimately as unacceptable as Turkish dominance. For restorationists, prophecy, not imperial glory, was their main concern. Finally, this led them to see the Jews the legitimization of their own nation and understand their own current prominence in world affairs. There are strong resonances, what I hear here in the contemporary situation in many parts of the world. He continues, if God had exalted the nation above all others and established her as the dominant maritime power, he had done so for a reason, in order that she may fulfill her appointed role and restore the Jews to Palestine. As Croom observed, prophecies of Jewish restoration acted as a legitimization of an informal empire of civilization. This was not Britain ruling the world, but a political ascendance preparatory to the restoration of the world in the Jewish millennium. So I would suggest that a study of Christian Zionism may well challenge and subvert some Orientalist readings of religious history and of international politics. How Christian Zionists conceive of their own role, or their own nation's role vis-a-vis the Jews and the Israeli state are important topics, and researchers need to keep asking about these relationships and how they may either support or subvert Orientalist readings of texts. 6, Christian Zionism and media. The Christian Zionist world is dominated today by evangelicals and charismatics. Driven by their desire to communicate the Christian gospel to the masses, they have been at the forefront of the adoption of new communication technologies, first in their enthusiastic embrace of radio in the 1920s and 30s, and then of television in the 1950s, and more recently, they have developed important means of communicating via the internet. And in countries like Brazil, they have an important media presence in radio and television. Questions that researchers might want to include are what media have the Christian Zionists made effective use of in a particular nation to gather support? 7, Christian Zionism's transnational networks or independent charismatic networks. Brad Christerson and Richard Flory, in their recent book, The Rise of Network Christianity, How Independent Leaders Are Changing the Religious Landscape, published by Oxford University Press in 2017, have argued that there has emerged a new form of charismatic Christianity, which is similar to the neo-charismatics of the 1970s, but which differs in 4 distinct ways. I go through those in my book and then suggest some more. I think it's important to somehow figure out who these groups are and where they're having influence. This is a pretty complex topic and it seems to be changing so quickly. But this phenomena of these independent charismatic networks with people calling themselves apostles, recognizing each other's authority, is remarkably international and globalized. And I think all researchers need to be asking whether this new form of independent network Christianity is influencing Christian Zionism in a specific local context. Number 8. There are 10 altogether, so I'm almost finished. Number 8, I've entitled Christian Zionism and the Catholic Question. From its origins in the second generation of the Reformation through to the late 19th century, Christian Restorationism, as it was called, before the invention of the term Christian Zionism, was a quintessentially Protestant movement and a quintessentially Calvinistic movement or Reformed movement within Protestantism. As I've argued, in the 17th century, English Protestants, and especially English Calvinists, saw the Protestant cause as opposed by the two great enemies of Protestantism. On the one hand, the Pope, which was, of course, a cipher for the Roman Catholic Church, and on the other hand, the Turk, which was a cipher for Islam. This runs throughout the literature of the 17th century. In the 19th century, many of the leading advocates of Christian Zionism in England were leaders in the no popery cause, which was another term given to the anti-Catholic movement in Britain. They, like their Puritan forebears, understood Protestants to be the best friends of the Jews and wanted to protect them from Muslim rulers and from Catholic anti-Semitism. But in the 20th century, a shift began to happen which lessened anti-Catholicism in the Christian Zionist discourse, and often it's not heard at all today. The Roman Catholic Church itself, as I've argued, moved away from its traditional opposition to Zionism, although slowly and belatedly, only recognizing Israel as a nation in, I think, 1993. Christian Zionism is now attracting some support in Catholic circles, and under the impact of the charismatic movement, Catholics and Protestants are often working together in many causes. This is more and more the case in North America among Christian Zionists, but in formerly Catholic countries, this may not be the case. We need to know more about how Christian Zionism is or is not becoming more ecumenical in its orientation country by country. 9, Christian Zionism and Philo-Semitism, ? Christian Zionists have long thought of themselves as Philo-Semites, and they see their support of Zionism as an expression of their love for the Jewish people. At the same time, Christian Zionists have sometimes expressed disturbing stereotypes of Jews and engaged in activities which some Jews regard as offensive. So, simple question, to what extent is a professed Philo-Semitism undermined by actions which Jews regard as incompatible with a professed love for the Jewish people? And 10, Christian Zionism and Jewish proselytism. Most devout Christian Zionists have historically been concerned with the return of the Jewish people to their homeland, but have also been eager to evangelize Jewish people. This has created a great deal of tension between the Christian Zionists and the Jews. Many Jews are highly suspicious of Christian Zionists because they see it as a way of preparing the ground for Christian evangelism of them. Some Christian Zionists, like William Heschler in the late 19th century, basically gave up on the evangelistic cause, believing that the Jews would respond to the Christian message at some point in the future, and it was not wise to continue to evangelize Jews in the present age. Daniel Hummel has written perceptively about this tension in American Christian Zionist circles in Israel with his study of Douglas Young, an important player in American evangelical circles in the 1970s and 80s, who did much to downplay Christian evangelism among Jews. Other Christian Zionist groups, like the Christian Embassy Jerusalem, forswear proselytism, and John Hagee, the leading American Christian Zionist, has waffled on the issue. So scholars in different contexts need to be alert to this tension and to be aware of how Christian Zionists are navigating this matter. These 10 areas, I suggest, are ones that scholars may want to consider as they study Christian Zionism in different national contexts. I'm sure that there are many other interesting topics, different angles that this could be looked at from, that I could have addressed, and I look forward to hearing what the real experts in the field think they are. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Donald. It's been already a very good start. Thank you for your presentation. I would like now to introduce you to Yaakov Ariel. He has a PhD from the University of Chicago. Ariel, okay, sorry. Yaakov Ariel. And he is a professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Yaakov, you have the floor now. Thank you for your acceptance and presence with us.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for that opportunity. If you can return the situation that the highlight is not on me because it's glowing. It doesn't allow me to see the screen actually. Can I ask whoever it is, the powers that be behind the scene, to not focus the highlight on me, but to turn me back into a regular citizen in a democratic society. Is that a possibility? If you can see,
okay.
If you can see the full screen, full.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry for being particular, but I have technical issues. Perhaps Chapel Hill, North Carolina is so far away from Sao Paulo, or perhaps it's my topic.
No problem. We are working this out. And hopefully in a few seconds we'll
I will use the time to thank you and the organizers, but also to say how much I'm happy to see a whole group of people here whose work I studied, whose work I read, whose work I recommended to students, whose work stands actually in bibliographies and syllabi that I give to students. This includes Paul Freston, whose books I use in my classroom, Donald Lewis, Daniel Hummel, and other people as well. With Donald Lewis, I have here an argument. On the one hand, his presentation was superb, and I agree with every word he said. But this is exactly my argument, my complaint, that you've stolen a lot of my thesis, a lot of my ideas. I thought that I would be very, very clever, very smart. I will present Christian Zionism and say many, many deep things and smart things, and will tell you this is long before John Nelson Darby, this is long before dispensationalism. But so now I have to create a different thesis and suggest other things, because already Donald Lewis has given you so much. So this is my complaint, Donald. I'm your fan, but I'm now also, I'm going to hold the grudge for 2 seconds, if you allow me. Okay, Christian Zionism.
Sorry, Yaakov, just 1 second. If you click on view and then gallery, you will, I think, sort your issue.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. Things are now much, much better. I feel so much more comfortable. I can see my own screen. Thank you.
All right.
Christian Zionism. I think that one thing that was missing is also how we define Christian Zionism. And I'm here, I must insist, Donald, on something slightly different than you. You emphasized correctly that Christian Zionism today includes also non-Protestants, non-evangelicals, non-pietists, and of course non-Puritans, because they're not around, at least not in the historical sense. But I think that it is very important to emphasize that Christian Zionism means Christian Zionism, Zionism that is motivated, pro-Zionist, proto-Zionist ideas and actions that are motivated by a Christian, I would call it biblical-messianic faith. A certain reading of the Bible, which is not necessarily prevalent among all Christian groups and all Christian denominations and all Christian traditions. a reading of the Bible was enormously enhanced by the Reformation, and even more so, not just by the Reformation, which is a huge, huge term, but particularly, not exclusively, but completely by the Reformed wing of the Reformation, and was incidentally influenced directly by John Calvin, his fascination with the Old Testament, and his understanding that the Jews are going to be redeemed and return to the historical arena. So I think that's very, very important to emphasize that you're totally right. This is long before dispensationalism. This goes back to the 16th century, certainly big time to the 17th century. We're going to discuss that. But it is motivated by Christian faith. Speaking of philo-Semitism, which is also a very complicated term, and Christian Zionism and philo-Semitism are two terms to be discussed, I think, in the same day, in the same perhaps hour, but not all philo-Semites are necessarily Christian Zionists. And although I would claim that with the complication of the term philo-Semitism, Christian Zionists are philo-Semites. That being said, I totally accept your remark that this doesn't mean that philo-Semites or Christian Zionists are devoid of stereotypes of Jews. The Christian Zionism, I would claim, was introduced into European culture and then into North American English, American culture, particularly in the 17th century. And that philo-Semitism in this case does not mean that you forgot all about the cultural bag of Christian understanding of who Jews were and what Judaism was. It doesn't mean that there is a whole new love. It does mean that there is a new love, if you will, for Jews, in the sense that you define, again, those old definitions, you define love as commitment to, devotion to, caring for. There was certainly love. This is philo-Jewish. This is philo-Semitism. But it doesn't mean that it's devoid of stereotypes. It doesn't mean that it's devoid of anger. Those people are messianically inclined. Those people have read the Bible. In writings of quite a number of Christian Zionists, including people that you describe, Donald, I'm kind of speaking to you and to everyone else at the same time, such as William Blackstone, you will find a lot of anger. Why haven't the Jews recognized Jesus when he came for the first time? This would have saved them and us and everybody so much trouble. Why is it so difficult to convince Jews in A, B, C, D, E, F, G? Why don't the Jews read correctly their own sacred scriptures? For crying out loud, for Jesus' sake. Why don't the Jews understand their own mission in history? This is, you can lose sleep at night over that. You can tear your hair. That's why I don't have any hair. Some of you do, and you sleep at night. Those questions are there. The anger is there, the anguish is there, stereotypes are there, and those stereotypes can come back and forth. The young reformer Martin Luther, you can say that he showed renewed interest in the Jews, that he was in some ways the forefather, not the father, but the great-great-grandfather of Christian Zionism in his early career as a reformer. But he then retracted back to what was then quite standard understanding of the Jews and their character. Young reformer Luther is in some ways the father, if you will, the forefather of Christian Zionism, of interest in the Jews, and interest in missionizing the Jews, and interest of bringing the Jews in, of interest in seeing the Jews redeemed. He gave up on that. John Calvin, I would say, is really the father, along with others, because he took it for granted that the Jews are in a certain place in history. But this is going to change. And that Christians ultimately are not better than Jews. What happened to the Jews can happen to Christians too. And he is, of course, the father of enormous renewed interest, along with other theologians of the Reformed tradition, in the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, if you will, as a charter to building a Christian society, which is something that has been extremely central to the covenant theology of Puritans. And for certainly renewed interest in England, as you mentioned, Donald, in England, especially among those influenced by the Reformed tradition, and in New England, and a whole series of publications and writings and insistence that the Jews are special, that they still have a role in history, that they are the heirs and continuers of historical Israel, that they were not cast away for good. They were not replaced by the church. Christian Zionism, in its essence, defies replacement theology. Christian Zionism is connected to philo-Semitism, which doesn't mean that you stop the historical arguments with Jews, and doesn't mean that you're not angry at Jews, but it does mean that you're interested in the Jews, that you want to be involved with the Jews, that you want to teach the Jews and instruct them as to their real place in history and their mission and calling. It means that you are, and this is where Christian Zionism and philo-Semitism really meet, it means that you're against harassments of Jews, physical or legal. It means that you're willing to step out and deny what you consider to be unfair accusations against Jews, such as the blood libel. Dozens of Christian Zionists along the way, including people Jews mistrusted, such as Franz Delitzsch, who wrote a whole tract against the blood libel. Those people went out of their way to, as Donald in some way said, not just against incidentally Catholic anti-Semitism. They were outraged in the 19th century over Russian Orthodox anti-Semitism. Blackstone was motivated, if you look at his Blackstone Memorial, the petition to the President of the United States, by the harassment of Jews in the Russian Empire, much more so than in Catholic countries or traditions. They were willing to protest anytime Jews were exiled, anytime there was anti-Jewish legislation, anytime there were blood libels. Christian Zionists, those seeing the Jews as holding a special role and place in God's plans for humanity, step out of the way. Yes, they were involved in missions. I want to come to that. Until the rise of Zionism, the main venue for Christian Zionists to express their interest in the Jews, their love, whatever you define it in this case, I claim it's there, their devotion for the Jews, their renewed hope for the Jews, was the mission. Missions were not, in contrary, Protestant missions to the Jews were Christian Zionists in their character. They were motivated by Messianic faith. They were promoting Messianic faith. They were promoting it not only among the Jews, they were promoting it among Protestants because that justified their existence, that justified their mission. Missions to the Jews published literature not only for Jews, we're going to come to that, but they published missions for literature for Protestants, emphasizing the importance of the Jews, emphasizing the Jews still hold a role in history, emphasize that the Jews are needed and important for the Messianic scheme. They were promoters, if you will, of pro-Jewish interests in the Christian community. Jews failed to see it. Many Christians failed to see it. Some of them did, including anti-Jewish, including anti-Semites. Anti-Semitism and missions don't go hand in hand. If you don't care for people, if you hate the people, if you totally mistrust them, if you wish them harm, you don't invest and dedicate your life for missionizing among them. Contrary to what post-colonial thinkers tell us, or scholars, missions were not there to just represent the interest of the antagonists. Missions were also agencies of protection of the people with which they worked. Missions were double embassies. They were representing a certain culture, certain set of values, certain theologies in one culture, of one culture in another culture, but then they were also representing the interests and the needs and the dignity, yes, the dignity and the safety of the people they were missionizing among the societies that sent them to missionize. And they're promoting the importance of missionary work and the importance of the people they worked with, because otherwise they wouldn't be there. And in the case of missions to the Jews, it was more than just they wouldn't be there. There was a messianic calling. This was giving God a hand, participating in the great mission, the mission of all times, of preparing the grounds to the return of Jesus to earth and the establishment of the kingdom of God to earth. Now I'm trying to be as provocative as I can, and let me be even more provocative. Donald, rightly so, mentioned William Blackstone, who was no intellectual and no systematic theologian, but this is someone from missions calling, probably. I misrepresented the case. I don't know if you hear it, I hope you don't. But William Blackstone, in his humble manner, he was a humble person, as global, full of enterprises and ideas, but humble. In his own way, yes, he reshaped dispensationalism. He shaped for a whole generation and more Christian, Protestant, messianic attitude towards the Jews. He was a founder of missions, the Chicago Hebrew Mission, and he was one of the major initiator of not just pro-Zionist, but of actual plans to give back Palestine to the Jews and to recreate in Palestine a Jewish commonwealth. But he was not the first. He was not the first, and he perhaps was not even the most important. We see that already in England of the 19th century. We're talking Pietists were the first to establish, not Puritans. Puritans wanted to work with the Jews. Puritans wanted to evangelize Jews, but they never systematized their work. The first systematic attempts at working with the Jews, educating the Jews, teaching Protestants about the Jews, creating literature in numerous languages, was the Institutum Judaicum of the Halle Pietists. The first university on earth that could be described as a Christian Zionist university, if you will. Not that this was its mission. It was the University of Halle, the first university ever, and for a long time the only one, to teach, let's say, courses on Yiddish in order to prepare and train missionaries for the Jews. The first, the Institutum Judaicum, which was established a quarter of a century later by a professor at the University of Halle, Johann Kallenberg, was the first Protestant systematic attempt of Christian Zionists, people holding to Messianic faith. And yes, people full of stereotypes of Jews, who at the same time were trying to steer interest in Jews, who wrote books about Jews and Judaism, who wrote books for Jews, not only about Christianity and about Protestant theology in a number of languages, Jewish languages, including by Immanuel Fromm, Tzadik be'emunato, right? This is the theology of the Lutheran theology of the cross. The righteous shall live by their faith. But this was the first institution that held to a messianic faith that motivated interest in the Jews, that was promoting it in the Protestant community, that was promoting not only Christian faith, Lutheran faith, was promoting among the Jews the Christian messianic faith in its pre-dispensationalist, quote-unquote, historicist, historical system of interpreting biblical chapters and verses and predicting dates. This institution was mimicked and copied by dozens of pietist agencies in Europe. One of the most famous one is the Prussian Missions to the Jews that worked in Berlin and other places until 1941, trying to resist the Nazis, failing, working among Jews who were left behind in Germany, in Nazi Germany, as already annihilation was arriving. The work of the Institutum Judaicum was picked by the British in the early 19th century with the rise of evangelicalism, with the renewed interest in messianic thought in its historical form, and not just the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, which by the late 19th century already had dozens of agencies around the globe with 200 full-fledged missionaries and others too, but by dozens of societies, including the dispensationalist Meldmay mission to the Jews, one out of a dozen, that worked, speaking of globalism, worked all over the Jewish world. Izmir, Aleppo, Johannesburg, Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo. Let's not forget Sao Paulo for the sake of our hosts. Such missions arrived in Brazil. I mean, I don't need to tell you because you're going all to speak about it. But globalism, Jewish globalism and Christian globalism and Messianic globalism and missionary globalism was all over the place, certainly in the 19th century. We can see it earlier when Puritans in New England who did not establish a mission themselves sent money at the turn of the 18th century from New England. I didn't even know until I read those sources. I didn't even know that you could send
Professor
money.
Ariel?
Yes.
Could you please wrap up? We are over 20 minutes now.
Okay, I will wrap things up. So I will come. I wanted to be
Okay,
very provocative.
thank you very much.
Okay, wanted to give more examples throughout the 19th century of British and German and Swedish Christian Zionists working in Palestine, helping Jewish settlers, supporting Jewish settlers, creating settlements themselves. I can't speak about that. Okay, I can just mention it. But I want to speak about the rise of Jewish Zionism. You all know about the fact that Theodor Herzl had a number of Christian Zionists working with him, advising him, helping him meet leaders of the world. You know that, I'm sure people will mention it. William Heschler, who was the chaplain of the Duke, Prince, whatever you want to call it, Baden-Baden, a relative, an uncle of the German emperor. Let's leave it there. Would there be Jewish Zionism as we know it without Christian Zionism? Would Jews at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th century, come up with grandiose political plans, try to meet and receive support of Christian leaders, try to sell their, what seemed to Jews, most Jews, overwhelmingly most Jews, as delusional plans, naive, delusional, messianic dreams? Would they come up without the ground prepared by Christian counterparts, without knowing that what they're proposing is, at least in some countries, in some Christian groups, a very, not just respectable and central, but that there is Christian support, Christian legitimation for their plans. Many people think about Zion, the Jews woke one day and decide to return to Palestine, so they did. This is a whole topic, this is a topic for a whole conversation, a whole conference. There wouldn't be Jewish Zionism without Christian Zionism. And we can see the relationship. Is that provocative enough? Or people needed me to send bombs through the internet? There wouldn't be such a thing. Those two groups then developed throughout the 20th century in tandem, encouraging each other. Would there be the kind of international Christian embassy without Jewish Zionism and the state of Israel? Post-Six-Day War, quote unquote. Would there be an Israel self-assured that there are Christians, which it sometimes mistrusted or misunderstood, or ignorant of the real purposes? Would there be there without the support, particularly in crucial moments such as 1917? People know about the Balfour Declaration and Christian Zionist pressure, support, groundwork in Britain. People don't know that the same thing happened in America, including with Donald Lewis Blackstone. I mean, Blackstone, we both own Blackstone, and so does Daniel. Would Woodrow Wilson give a silent, behind-the-scene acquiescence to the plan, to the Balfour Declaration? Would there be the development of Zionism, Jewish Zionism as we know it, without Christian Zionism? This is a co-project. It's not just that it's today that people say, well, the Christian lobby is actually important more than the Jewish lobby. This was true in 1917, when church dignitaries and church committees went to see Wilson and handed him petitions.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor Ariel. We are really short of time now.
I'm in the midst of convincing you of the great events of history, and I'm being in the midst of it all asked to keep silent. But what would I do for the sake?
I'm sorry, I have to. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your very provocative comments. We are glad now to continue our conversation, introducing you Daniel Hummel. He has a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is a research fellow in their history department, and he's director for university engagement at Upper House, a Christian organization based at the University of Wisconsin campus. So Daniel, thank you very much for being with us. You have the floor.
Great, thank you. And hello, it's a pleasure to speak to you today from Madison, Wisconsin, and to be on a panel with such distinguished co-speakers and with such an engaged group of people here. I want to start just with a few qualifiers about myself. I'm a US historian of the 20th century, so I approach questions of Christian Zionism, at least initially, from that possibly limited understanding of the history of Christian Zionism and of the Global South, And I have a particular angle into Christian Zionism that emphasizes networks of influence and institutions in particular. And so as such, I'm interested in Christian Zionism in a particular way. I don't have one set definition I go with all the time, but one that I use sometimes is as a social and political movement of Christian support for the state of Israel based on a mix of biblical and non-biblical arguments. And this definition tends to prioritize leaders who are politically active, run large churches or other organizations, and usually have an explicit goal of mobilizing Christians politically for Israel. This way of thinking about it often ignores theological or cultural attitudes until they become politically organized. So someone that's often invoked is someone like Hal Lindsey, who wrote a very popular book in the 1970s that had a lot to do with Israel in the end times. I find him a less interesting figure, in part because he didn't really personally invest himself in mobilizing Christians in a sort of organized way. There are other people that are less well known that I find more interesting because they spent a lot of their careers actually trying to mobilize Christians on the ground. And finally, another qualifier, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go deeply here into the theology of Christian Zionism or the details of the differences between evangelicals and Pentecostals, which is actually a very important distinction that I will be highlighting. I'll take it for granted that many here appreciate that difference. And of course, I'd love to explore some of the differences, particularly in theology, in the Q&A, if that's of interest. But what I'm trying to convey here is a shift in the network influence from American evangelical to non-American Pentecostal leadership in the last few decades in the Christian Zionist world. So with those qualifiers, I want to focus on a specific and much more recent and narrow episode than both Yaakov and Donald have talked about, a cultural and institutional exchange that sits within the larger framework that we've been talking about. And that exchange is the transfer of institutional leadership from North Americans to Europeans in the 1970s and 80s. And I really want to focus on the form of the International Christian Embassy. That's if you want to look it up while you're watching, that's icej.org. And the attendant growth of the embassy's membership among Global South Pentecostals. And if there's one takeaway from this talk, it would be something like the embassy is a microcosm of a macro trend in the last 40 years, and that's the Pentecostalization of Christian Zionist political activism. If you go back 50 years and you try to survey or get a heat map of where Christian Zionist political infrastructure is, it's for one thing much smaller. But what does exist is often deeply influenced by American evangelicals in the orbit around Billy Graham, with a few fringe fundamentalists also operating. Today, the infrastructure has just multiplied greatly and expanded, and is dominated by Pentecostals, still led mostly by American and European Pentecostals, but attracts a membership that's global in scope. So the embassy is a good example of this. It's currently, I would say, the largest Christian Zionist organization in the world, in terms of membership for sure. And the embassy has offices in more than 85 countries and a budget in the tens of millions. And it has had, it sort of represents this transfer of leadership beyond North America. And so there are three stages I want to go through in this talk. I want to talk about the American origins of the embassy idea, the actual founding and the European leadership that founded it, and then briefly how it is plugging into more global networks in its work. And so even as I list these stages, it should be apparent that the story I'm telling is not happening in a vacuum. It reflects broader trends in the history of global Christianity since the 70s. And I'm sure we'll be discussing this in a lot of different ways in the next couple of days. The growth of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity in recent decades, something for shorthand I often call spirit-filled Christianity, mostly just to cut down on the syllables. But with that, I want to find the roots of much of today's global Zionist activism in the history of American Christian Zionist activism. So I think there's a deep connection here that I'll try to highlight in the story here. And that activism in America obviously has a very long history, some that Yaakov just highlighted and Don has also made clear. But I'll be picking up in the mid-70s when its institutional locus at least is run in large part by North Americans. So I want to start by saying, when we're talking about the origins of the embassy idea, we're in the 1970s, and really there's a key figure, and Donald mentioned him briefly, someone I've spent a lot of time looking at, a Canadian evangelical named G. Douglas Young. And he was a Canadian missionary kid in Korea. He lived most of his adult life in Philadelphia and Chicago before moving to Jerusalem permanently in the 1960s. And as far as his education, he grew up in the broader fundamentalist world. He went to a place called Westminster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, and then to its offshoot called Faith Seminary, which broke away during the fundamentalist years because it was premillennial, and it had a part of its theology had a role for the future of Israel in it. And he was part of that sort of sub-tradition within fundamentalism. For Young, World War II was a turning point. He was a pastor in Philadelphia, and he, during the war, increasingly felt guilty over the lack of the American church's response to the Holocaust. And you can tell just sort of for the rest of his life, he had this overwhelming sense that he wished he had done more during the war, and he continually called the church to do more to combat what he saw as sort of the Christian world's attack on the Jewish people in the form of the Holocaust. After the war, Young became sort of a mid-level leader in the neo-evangelical movement. That's the loose network of schools and organizations and media outlets that were associated with Billy Graham. Young worked as a dean at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Chicago, and he was a leader in numerous scholarly evangelical associations at the time. He began to take tours of the Middle East, and on one such tour in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, he became convinced that the American media was anti-Israel in bias. And so his solution to that was he founded something called the American Institute of Holy Land Studies in Jerusalem, which was a combination educational and cultural diplomacy outfit. And this was a very successful operation. It's actually still in operation. It's changed a lot, and it's now called Jerusalem University College. But this work elevated Young to the top of the list of North American Christian Zionists. And over the next few decades, through the 1967 war, the 1973 war, Young was one of the most consulted Christian leaders in the world by the Israeli government, by American evangelicals, and by American Jews as well. And by the time he had reached the height of his international influence, Young came to believe that there was sort of a limit of growth for Christian Zionism among American evangelicals, and he thought the future lay in the Pentecostal world, which was booming at the time through missions work and revivals around the globe. And so in 1976, Young began plans for what he called a Congress in the mold of the historic Zionist Congresses of Theodore Herzl to articulate what he called for Bible-believing Christians. That would be sort of this container that would hold all types of conservative Protestants to support Israel. And an early partner for him was a Cuban-American missionary named Israel Carmona, who was plugged into the Calvary Chapel network in California. Carmona was a professor at a fundamentalist school in California called Biola College. And Carmona was this bridge to the Pentecostal community that Young himself did not have. So together, Young and Carmona became the organizers of what was called the International Congress for the Peace of Jerusalem. It happened in early 1978. Menachem Begin attended. It was a big deal. Hundreds of Christian leaders from around the world attended. What came out of that Congress was a new body called International Christians for Israel. And I apologize, a lot of these organizations all have very similar names. You could probably have 10 words and just scramble them around, and you'd have about all the different organizations. But I will try to keep track of these. The International Christians for Israel was a new organization, and its unique twist on what you could track as the last 10 organizations before that was that it had a majority Pentecostal leadership board. And this was a crucial shift from, as in my understanding, virtually every other American-run Christian Zionist organization up to that time. Young was actually the only non-Pentecostal on the board. And in addition to Young, there was a guy named Chuck Smith, who was actually the head of the Calvary Chapel movement, a very important American evangelical. And then there were leaders from France, Norway, and South Africa, all representing more charismatic or neo-charismatic traditions in those countries. The diversity of International Christians for Israel reflected trends in the growth of Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity in Europe and English-speaking countries in the 70s. And there were these revivals that began to sweep across Northern Europe and Central Europe, sparking prophetic interest in Israel from those countries that historically had not had a very strong Christian Zionist presence. And International Christians for Israel was one of these first international organizations that was riding this wave. And it wasn't the only organization, though. Young actually had another organization that was called Bridges for Peace. It's a huge organization today. It's one of the largest foreign social service providers in Israel, actually. And it has also moved into the Pentecostal world and has offices in more than a dozen countries. Others founded at the same time in the late 70s included organizations in South Africa, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and in Finland. Okay, so that's the Congress. In the wake of the Congress, a new cast of characters, largely coming out of European charismatic circles, begin to take the center stage and pick up where this organizing was left off by Young. Most important was a figure named Jan Willem van der Hoeven, who was a Dutch activist and an ardent sort of right-wing type Zionist, who helped found something called the Almond Branch Association. And I know Yaakov has written about this a lot. I relied on a lot of his stuff the first time I was trying to grapple with this. The Almond Branch Association was a group of mostly charismatic leaders that formed in Jerusalem in 1979. Other members of the Almond Branch Association were expatriates from Canada and South Africa and Great Britain and Australia. And these were mostly English-speaking Pentecostal and charismatic Christians that were part of this growing neo-charismatic world. The Almond Branch Association organized its first public event to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Sukkot in 1979. And they did this because they desired to appeal to Israelis on sort of shared cultural terms, and they were interested in adopting Jewish religious practices in their Christian context. The celebration was a success. There were about 1,000 people that attended, and they were from more than 20 countries. And these spirit-centered activists, led by van der Hoeven, soon found an opportunity to endear themselves more directly to the Israeli government. In 1980, the Israeli Knesset passed the Jerusalem law that declared the city the undivided eternal capital of the state of Israel. This prompted more than a dozen states, including many Latin American states, and including van der Hoeven's home of the Netherlands, to move their embassies away from Jerusalem in protest. And so the Almond Branch Association responded by planning a new Christian Zionist organization called the International Christian Embassy. And they celebrated and sort of unveiled this, claiming to represent all Christians in the world at this embassy at their second Feast of Tabernacles celebration, which was bigger than the first one. And so with van der Hoeven as its director, the embassy became headquartered in Jerusalem and took over actually the Chilean embassy, which was evacuated after the Knesset passed this law. And though the embassy initially depended largely on American financial support, it quickly diversified and branched out and was actually in more than 40 countries by the end of the 1980s. And the Zionism preached by van der Hoeven was distinct from the Zionism of someone like Young. And Young actually died of a heart attack in 1980, and I'm sure he would have been more involved had he continued to live. But he was sort of out of the picture by the time the embassy was founded. And the differences revealed some of the influence of spirit-centered Christianity on the movement. And this included an emphasis on spiritual warfare, an emphasis on what I've tried to coin in other contexts as sort of nation-based prosperity theology that sees Genesis 12:3, God's promise to bless those who bless Abraham, as sort of a contractual obligation by God in some ways to bless Christians. And they also traced their genealogy through the Christian tradition, not through dispensationalists in the United States, but through restorationists in Europe, including Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, and people like British Pentecostal revivalist Derek Prince. And this restorationist genealogy was much less, I would say it was much less apocalyptic, at least in the common sort of rapture, Armageddon type apocalypticism. It was very messianic, but it looked for the state of Israel as a miracle in the faithfulness of God and God's covenantal commitments. But it really sought to distinguish itself from the American scene. And the growth of the embassy over the 80s was reflected in the expansion of that Feast of Tabernacles celebration, which is still sort of the biggest thing the embassy does. There were 1,000 attendees in 1980. By 1984, there were 5,000 attendees. And by the 90s, the number of countries represented was over 70. And today, there's over 100 usually represented. And finally, in 1985, the embassy organized its first International Christian Zionist Conference. And this was a fulfillment of Young's original vision a decade earlier to replicate the Zionist conferences of the early Zionist movement. That gathering was held in the same Basel, Switzerland hall that hosted Theodor Herzl at the first Zionist Congress in 1897. And it was a group of more than 500, almost all Pentecostal Christians from 5 continents. And they're talking in this way of blessing Israel or comforting Israel and focusing on this blessing, nation-based blessing theology. And the gathering was still led by Europeans, including van der Hoeven, and then South African minister Malcolm Hedding is another important person who takes over for van der Hoeven in 2000 at the embassy. And so in the 80s and 90s, these Christian Zionists from Europe would often lead the charge in articulating Christian support for Israel globally. The embassy filled a vacuum of American leadership in the 90s, and that vacuum is something I can talk about later. And this work really elevated the embassy in the global Christian Zionist scene. Okay, getting to my last stage here is the expansion of the embassy into global South networks. And that's a stage we're still in the midst of. And the embassy is still led by Europeans. It's now led by a German Pentecostal named Jürgen Bühler. And I want to focus here just though on one of the representatives of global Christian Zionism. And maybe that's someone that people here know more about than I do. And that's René Terranova, who's currently the embassy's branch director for Brazil. Terranova is a Catholic. He was born a Catholic, converted to Pentecostal Christianity. He emphasizes something he calls family restoration, which is a concept he applies sort of to personal life and personal family life, but also to God's family of Jews and Christians. He leads massive tour groups through Israel, and he combines this with a teaching that God will bless Brazilians who bless Israel through material prosperity. Terranova is one of many people who is doing this. There are a number across the globe. One more I'd highlight is Mosi Medugba, a Nigerian pastor and evangelist who directs Spiritual Life Outreach and the Ministry Prayer Network. And he claims to be able to reach over 10,000 pastors worldwide, and mostly in Africa, with a similar way. And I have a bunch of examples of others who are doing the same type of work, all plugged into the embassy and sort of coordinated from the center. And then here, I'll finish here. I just want to highlight that even as people like Terranova are sort of the new wave of global Christian Zionism, the entirety of the embassy leadership remains European. In addition to Bühler, there's a guy named Mojmir Kalas who founded the Czech Republic branch of the embassy. He's the vice president of international affairs. And then the 2 senior spokesmen of the embassy are David Parsons, an American lawyer, and Malcolm Hedding, who was the predecessor to Bühler. They're all Pentecostals as well. And in total, the globalization of Christian Zionism, I would argue, has profoundly reshaped the movement in the 21st century. And the rising profile of Pentecostal and charismatic Christians in the US, Europe, and the global South has redefined the movement's aims, reach, and influence over the last 50 years. And finally, it's this connection between the spread of spirit-filled Christianity and spirit-filled Christian Zionism that I'll leave you with, that connection. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. You actually did not use all your time, so if you still want to use a minute or two, you can do it.
Oh boy, it's an embarrassment of riches here.
Only if you want to.
Sure. I guess I'll say one more thing about René Terranova. So he's this Brazilian leader in the embassy. His main activities on behalf of Israel include leading these huge tours to Israel, include speaking at Christian Zionist events around the globe, and many in Israel as well. And he also is deeply connected to Brazilian politics, and he is one of the major boosters of Jair Bolsonaro, and was sort of an early supporter of him as well. And so that's something I didn't have time to get into here, but there are deep geopolitical implications for the way people like Terranova can shape their local national politics, but that a lot of the guidance, or at least a lot of the coordination, is actually through organizations like the Christian Embassy, that you really wouldn't even make that connection maybe unless you're trying to look for those connections across the globe. So I'll end there.
That's great. Thank you very much. Following our dynamics, we have invited some people to provide a first round of questions who have some kind of engagement with the theme or who have a very keen interest in the theme. And today, for this panel, we have one of these persons, Professor Misha Klein, who, if she is ready, could make her comment or question addressed to any or all of the speakers. And following her, I am going to read out two questions which have come, so you can then have your chance to respond to. So, Professor Klein.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Oh, it's morning here where I am. Thank you for this opportunity to hear these very interesting presentations, to open up this multi-day conversation. And I think it's a theme that has gotten a lot of people's attention because of these the movement of Christian Zionism into a more public sphere, when we see this in some of the right-wing protests, both in the United States and Israel, and I imagine elsewhere. I'm an anthropologist, and I am working on a project related to this in Brazil, together with my colleague Michel German from the Federal University in Rio, who's speaking on Wednesday. And many of the points that were brought up are points that in our research we're kind of bouncing off of, but there are a couple of things that struck me in the opening presentations. One having to do with philo-Semitism. And I quite agree with Dr. Ariel that philo-Semitism is in fact not contrary to hatred of Jews. That isn't quite how he put it, but I say this only because philo-Semitism, like anti-Semitism, continues to be rooted in stereotypes. And sometimes people get distracted by the idea that stereotypes are positive stereotypes, but they're nevertheless stereotypes which can be spun, they can be manipulated, and they're not actually engaging with people. So there's what I would further like to suggest, and perhaps this is provocative in Dr. Ariel's line, is to suggest that this philo-Semitism actually has very little, if anything, to do with Jews. That the interest in Jews or Judaism or Jewishness in broader terms is a tendency to be interested in Jewish material culture, to be interested in historical landscapes associated with the ancient Israelites, but not in Jews per se. Now, this may play out differently in different cultural and political contexts, but I certainly see this in the Brazilian context. The interest in Israel, the interest in things Jewish, does not engage actual Jews. Now, in terms of missionizing, in terms of attempts to bring Jews on board, that of course is a different project. But when I'm thinking about this use of Jewish symbols, for example, everything from the Israeli flag to the shofar in these different protests, I hesitate to, but I might as well bring up some of the recent uses of the Holocaust in part of the resistance to the vaccine, this attachment to a certain view of Jews as being defined through their experiences of exclusion and genocide, and then making that this point of equivalence to all forms of infringement on so-called freedoms. I might be productively or at least provocatively looked at in relation to this larger question. But I think that philo-Semitism is about an idea of Jews, not about Jews. And I think that confusion between the idea of Jews and actual Jews is the source of a lot of confusion. So I think that it might be worth our trying to come up with a different word other than appropriation, because appropriation is using other people's stuff, to put a dull point on it. But when the goal is so much more powerful and transformational, I think that we need a different concept, one that suggests that a taking over of certain kinds of interests of a group. And to that end, I also want to ask the speakers to address the relationship between politics and specifically imperial interests and religion, because I don't think it's enough to say that the interests of Christian Zionists have been purely religious. And I don't think any of you are saying that, but I'd like to take it further to address the relationship between religion and politics, which we see in so many different forums, especially in relation to colonialism and imperialism, and the way in which religion, not just Christianity, but especially Christianity, have gone hand in hand. So those are my thoughts in relation to your presentations. I'm sorry?
Sorry.
I'm finished.
Ask you, please.
That was it.
All right. That's great. Thank you very much. We just before I pass hand the floor again back to our speakers, we have 2 or 3 questions that I would like to read out that are directed to you, addressed to you, and I don't know if they are going to be shown now on screen. See? And then I can read them. Right. So, the first question is by Igor Sabino, who's on our Zoom, who's on Zoom right now, to Dr. Donald Lewis. On your latest book, you dedicate a whole chapter to discuss the so-called New Christian Zionism, promoted by Dr. Gerald McDermott. Do you think this movement can gain traction in places such as Africa and South America? Or is it too intellectual if compared with the prosperity theological Christian Zionism promoted in these areas of the world? This is question number 1. Question number 2 from David Lehman. Daniel, can you explain the difference between Pentecostalism and evangelicals to those accustomed to Latin American usage, in which they are used interchangeably? I know that in North America it is different, but how? One more question from Leandro Fontana. Professor Daniel Hummel, could you please elucidate a bit more what the vacuum that led to the transfer of power from North America to Europe would consist in? Are there also theological reasons, or are they mainly geopolitical? So these are the questions, and I am glad to ask our speakers to respond to them, to comment them. Even if the question hasn't been directly addressed to you, but if you wish to make a comment, please feel free to do so. Let's say you could speak for about 5 minutes, and if we still have some time, we may bring up some more questions. Donald, please. Oh, Ariel, Professor Ariel, do you want to ask a question? Is that?
Ask a question. I wondered if there is such a possibility.
There is, of course.
To respond to Misha Klein, if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
First of all, I wanted to tell Professor Misha Klein that I enjoyed your comments. I enjoyed or appreciated your comments. They're well taken. Yes, philosemitism is a very tricky term, and I respect people who are unwilling to use that term. I'm also sometimes reluctant to use that term because I think it's very, very complex. But there's one other thing to add to what you said, and this is that the relationship between Christian Zionists and Jews, the philosemitic element, if you will, the instrumental element, as you've placed it, relating to imaginary Jews, to theoretical Jews, to ancient Jews, to material culture, to realities in the land of Israel, but not to actual Jews as a people, that this too is not static. It's not always there. I have seen situations in which Christian Zionist thinkers, leaders, writers get engaged with Jews, and then their writings and thought changes. I've seen even, and that's even for me more amazing, Jews who have a certain stereotype or instrumental attitudes towards Christian Zionists, but as they become friends, as they engage with each other, their attitudes change. I've seen mutual influences. You could, if you wish, and this would also be a stereotype, describe the relationship, particularly in the early stages, of Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists or Israeli leaders to what you'd call a marriage of convenience. They are interested in each other for their own needs. There's no real love or real feeling or real passion there. But amazingly, what I've seen that this too changes. I've learned from that about marriage of convenience, that it can start as an instrumental pact and end up as very devoted and compassionate or passionate. And I would not say that Philo-Semites are just those cold people who sit there theorizing about Jews or relating to Jews in instrumental or material ways. I've seen interactions that change people and change ideas and change policies even towards each other. I can give concrete examples of books, publications, lectures, names, choices, and how those two groups interact with each other in a way that's dynamic and not static. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Lewis. Your mic is off.
Great. Before I answer the question of New Christian Zionism, I think that Andrew Crome, in his book on English national identity, talks about philo-Semitism and suggests the term allo-Semitism, meaning the Jew is regarded as different, whether that's positively conceived or negatively conceived. But the Jews in Christian thinking are always, especially in Christian Zionist thinking, are always different. So that's Crome's work is, I think, excellent and worth thinking about when it comes to this question of philo-Semitism. The New Christian Zionism work by Jerry McDermott, I don't think that's going to have much impact. It's a bit, if comparing it to the prosperity gospel, it's a bit like comparing a candle to a forest fire. So I don't think that it will have some impact in some circles, but I think overall it's not going to be that significant.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lewis. Professor Hummel.
Thanks, and thanks for the questions. Yeah, and I apologize. My distinction between Pentecostal and evangelical comes out of my training as a U.S. historian, where this is a pretty important distinction. And I realize that there's, I mean, even in European context, the term evangelical means something far different than it does in the American context. So there's a lot of ways to think about the distinction between Pentecostals and evangelicals. One predominant one is thinking theologically, and there's the sort of defining mark of Pentecostals is their belief in the Holy Spirit being, you could say, far more active in manifesting in certain types of religious practices. The key one for a lot of this history has been speaking in tongues, and the sort of mark of a Pentecostal is someone who has a second baptism and is speaking in tongues. There's a whole other tradition that is what you might call the more broadly American evangelical tradition that is cessationist on these things and does not see speaking in tongues as a necessary sign of the Christian life, and in some cases is very skeptical that that's a real manifestation of the Spirit. This comes out of the origins of the Pentecostal movement in the early 20th century, which comes out of more of the holiness traditions. And then you have the evangelical fundamentalist tradition that's more reformed. And I'm really simplifying here. But these traditions develop alongside each other through the 20th century and are both very conservative theologically, if you're looking at a broader spectrum that includes liberal Protestants and others, but are sort of parallel, but often aren't interacting very much. And so one of the remarkable things in the late 20th century, and in particularly in American politics, is how Pentecostals and fundamentalists and evangelicals got to sort of see past each other or see through these theological differences to work together toward certain conservative political goals. And there's different terms used for that. Co-belligerency is one of them. But I just want to highlight one really good book by Neil Young called We Gather Together. It's a few years ago, that talks about interfaith relations on the Christian right. And a lot of it is about these distinctions and how they're overcome, and then how terms like evangelicals start taking on much more political significance than these theological differences. And those distinctions play out, though, in a sociological way, that there are distinct Pentecostal networks and distinct evangelical networks. So if you're a evangelical, you have certain places you go and certain places you don't. Pentecostals have different places you go and places you don't. And so that's just a key distinction. And most of the growth in global Christianity has been in the more Pentecostal charismatic traditions, and far less in the American evangelical cessationist type traditions. Okay, so that's my 3-minute attempt to define that. The other question about the vacuum of leadership on the US side, this is, I talk about this in my book, Covenant Brothers, in large detail. But when you get to the 1980s and you have a really robust American Christian Zionist political movement, it's often cited as being led by Jerry Falwell in the 1980s, and he's the head of the Moral Majority. And then in the 1990s, you have what's called the Christian Coalition, which is a sort of like a Moral Majority type grassroots organization led by Pat Robertson. And Robertson was just in the news. He's finally retiring from his role as a TV host for over 50 years. But those two figures, Falwell and Robertson, dominate the Christian Zionist leadership in America. Both of them, in my interpretation, are pretty poor leaders of the movement. And in part, that's because they have their hands in like a dozen different issues, many of them domestic policy issues. And then Israel is this one of the few foreign policy issues that they are very concerned about. They have a lot of missteps that I go through in the book, a lot of things they say that offend Jews or other Christians, and they basically aren't very good at leading a national Christian Zionist movement. This is at the same time that the Christian Embassy is really ramping up its own operations and is very, in some ways, much more competent of an organization. It flips a little on the American side when you get to the 2000s and you get Christians Unite for Israel introduced in 2006, which is the first national single issue Christian Zionist organization in the American scene. And so then you have a very robust American sort of single voice for American Christian Zionism. But through the 80s and the 90s, that is not the case. And a lot of what's happening is actually crisis management more than building a sort of a focused, mobilized pro-Israel evangelical constituency. So that's what I mean by the power vacuum in the 80s and 90s.
Thank you, Daniel. Professor Ariel, he wants to make a further comment.
Yeah, I want to make another comment, and that is that all the questions and the answers and the emphasis here have been very much on political Zionism, on Christian Zionism as a political movement, as a movement that perhaps has started with theological premises, contains theological premises, but then of course the interest in the movement is because of its political impact or political importance. Mm-hmm. I'd like to emphasize something that I don't think was brought up, and this is that Christian Zionism, from my perspective, created something that is much more interesting and much more meaningful than just political power, political influence, political alliances, political lobbies. It gave rise to what I would call borderline culture, to interactions between Christianity and Judaism, or Christians and Jews, Christians and Judaism, that created not just missions, which I so much emphasized, but communities of quote unquote Christian Jewish believers in Jesus, Christian Judaizing, if you will, that would have been the Catholic term and sometimes Protestant terms historically. It gave rise to incredible literature in numerous languages, to dozens of journals, thousands of volumes, thousands of tracts, but created also a borderline in between, if you will, faith, communities, interactions, creativity, theology that would not have been there without the Christian Zionist movement. I think this is, for me, even more significant than the political importance of Christian Zionism as part of the evangelical movement and as part of the dispensationalist faith in America or elsewhere. And I hope that people will address in this conference that impact or that creativity or that borderline traditions that were created in the Southern Hemisphere and in Brazil.
Okay, thank you, Professor Ariel. We have time for 2 more questions, which will be shown on the screen. One of them from Yael Mabat, sorry if I don't get it right. How do the speakers think that demographic transformations in the US, specifically the decline of the number of white evangelicals on the one hand, and the conversion of Latinos to evangelicalism, Pentecostalism on the other hand, influences Christian Zionism? This is the first one. Second one from Virginia Garab. There's an R there. In Latin America, all Protestants are evangelicals or evangelicals without distinction. There are also differences within Pentecostalism between classical Pentecostalism and neo-Pentecostalism, although people in the churches would not necessarily recognize these terms. Paul Freston has written very nicely about these distinctions. So this is mostly a comment on these different meanings, varying meanings between Protestantism, Pentecostalism, evangelicalism, and so on in relation to the evangelical or evangelical. Can I just wrap this with a question from me, taking the the opportunity as well, and this will be our final round, and then return the floor to our speakers so they can comment and make their final remarks. My question is, what hypothesis would you have about this huge prevalence of Pentecostalism in terms of the driving force of recent forms of Christian Zionism? So if you can add this to the other 2 questions and comment, and the one comment, please. I'll leave it for you to decide the order. So whoever wishes to speak first, just give me a sign. Can I say Donald then? Your mic is off, Donald.
There we are. On the question, which I don't really have anything to say, is the influence of the rising influence of Spanish converts in America. I'm not an American. I don't understand the American community anywhere as well as our 2 American speakers do. So I will pass that over to the other 2. I'm sure Daniel and Yaakov have great insights on this.
I don't know if I can speak. I'm intrigued by all the questions, but I think a huge question is the question asked by Yael Mabat on the decline in the numbers of white evangelicals in America. Incidentally, as part of a much larger decline in participation in church life and the rise, if you will, of the quote-unquote nuns, those are unaffiliated, and the rise of those who openly declare themselves to be agnostic or even atheistic in America, something that during the Cold War era was almost unheard of. It's very much, I would say, an impact of the end of the Cold War and the reconfiguration of American religious life. I don't think that we do know not only that there is a decline in the number of white evangelicals, we know specifically that there is a decline among younger evangelicals in adoption of Christian Zionist stance. I can refer you to a study a questionnaire conducted by Moti Inbari among thousands of evangelical Christians, and there is a decline in interest in or commitment to Christian Zionism, and a rise of what, if you're speaking of the political impact, a rise of a more balanced or critical attitude towards Israel. So I think that too, I assume, would interest you. That being said, and again here, like I'm here skeptical over the skeptics, because the heyday of Christian Zionism was really the post 6-Day War, the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. They reached a peak of influence on American policies, starting with the Reagan administration and following. And we can already see a decline in their impact on American policies. The Donald Trump era that relied on evangelical, on evangelical support, conservative evangelical support, was in some ways, you would say, the outlier, I would claim, as far as American religious attitudes towards Israel are concerned. And very misleading, both from the Israeli side and the American side. We can expect on the political level changes of attitude and policies, yes. But the history of evangelicalism and Christian Zionism in America is, again, it's not static, it's dynamic. We have seen eras of greater interest in Christian Zionist ideas and faith, and eras in which you could speak about, I don't know, of decline or of remote, or of being separated from the limelight. You know, people were surprised in the 1970s. It's not just Christian Zionism. People were surprised in the 1970s with the resurgence of evangelicalism. People were surprised. This is 1976. For me, it was yesterday. For you, it's ancient history. People were shocked during the campaign of Jimmy Carter to discover this huge religious infrastructure in the south of the United States and beyond the south of the United States. People were speaking for decades about decline of religion, of the decline of its importance in private life, in public life. We don't know yet what the future brings. American Protestantism sees a whole series of revivals, of return to tradition, of recreation of evangelical Christianity, recreating itself, coming in new guises, coming in new forms with new ideas. I would not yet write a eulogy for the centrality or the relative centrality or importance. Christian Zionism was never ubiquitous. It was never as if all evangelical Christians in America, including Pentecostals, were all Christian Zionists to the core. So I'm still skeptical about the skepticism, and I'm still looking forward to seeing what's going to happen. One thing I am sure is going to happen, and this is that evangelical Christianity in America will continue to be resourceful, creative, attempting to grow and influence in different ways, including in ways that it has not yet demonstrated. Speaking about Donald Lewis saying, well, he is skeptical about certain fringe movements, but I hope that you're not skeptical, Donald, about the centrality and the vigorous presence and resourcefulness of evangelical Christianity, globally conceived. And of course, there's the question how this, something that the whole conference is about, that Christian Zionism is now global and not just merely Anglo-American or European American or American.
Thank you very much, Professor Ariel. Daniel, please.
Yeah, I can pick up there. I agree largely with what Yaakov said. I mean, one way to think about the decline of white evangelicalism is through looking at one of the major Christian Zionist organizations, Christians United for Israel, which is led by John Hagee in Texas, is by far the largest dedicated Christian Zionist organization. They claim to have 10 million members. I think that's inflated. I think I'm a member because I'm on their email list because I want to see what they write about. But even that, give them their most inflated numbers, that is a quarter at best, maybe less, of all of people who would call themselves evangelicals in America. And so it's not a majority view. We often can, and because we're focused on this topic, make that mistake and think that the average evangelical walking around is like really tuned into Middle East politics and is philo-Semitic and all that kind of stuff. Some of that stuff might be latent. It's definitely in the culture. But in terms of people activated and voting or organizing or giving money to these issues, it's a minority view, even in a place like the United States. And so the decline in white evangelicalism over the last few decades, I don't think it's coming from that group, from the like committed hardcore Christian Zionists. It's coming from the millennials deconstructing their faith. It's coming from people who are sort of on the seeing evangelicalism becoming too political and leaving the faith. And so I see a somewhat, from their perspective, at least sustainable future for Christian Zionism among white evangelicals in the US. I see that also because of this distinction between Pentecostals and evangelicals. So if you look at the decline, church attendance is declining in the US. There are counterexamples to that. One of them is like the Assemblies of God, which is one of the largest Pentecostal denominations in the world, and particularly in the US. They've actually grown in the last decade. There was just an article about that a couple of weeks ago. And so there is growth in some of the communities where Christian Zionism would be sort of present. And then also, because it's the Pentecostal Christians who now lead organizations like Christians Unite for Israel, they have a natural bridge to Latino Pentecostals in the US and then to the broader Pentecostal world that, frankly, earlier organizations, even people like Jerry Falwell, who was an independent Baptist who would not allow people speaking in tongues in his church, he had this massive theological barrier to working with non-American Christians of any type, really. But even to working with charismatic and Pentecostal Christians in the US. And there's great sort of stories about his issues with many of the other leaders in the Christian right, even in the 80s, on these issues. But the leadership now has moved away from that and is much more embracing of global Pentecostal networks. And so there is also this whole other untapped collaboration between American Christian Zionists, even if they might be small, numerically in decline, with this much bigger global Christian Zionist world that to me points to, they're not going away anytime soon. In fact, the movement's growing. And while the American part will maybe be a smaller part growing forward, even though it's already a pretty small part, it'll still be present and it'll still be active in these networks. And if the embassy is an indicator, we'll still actually be in the leadership positions in some of these networks, even if the rank and file of a lot of these networks are non-American, non-Western Pentecostals.
Thank you very much, Daniel. My appreciation to our three speakers during this first session, Donald Lewis, Yaakov Ariel, and Daniel Hummel. Thank you very much for your contribution. I think we are off to a very good start already. A number of issues, a very broad agenda, which has been proposed to us here. Already some critical issues to face. I also thank Professor Misha Klein for her participation and for the questions and comments that we could read out, plus some other ones that are on the Zoom platform's chat. So I hope that this has kind of enticed each and every one of you who have joined us today to continue with us. We will have another session this afternoon, and we invite you to be with us in, say, about 1 hour and a half or so. So thank you very much for your participation. And once again, my warm thanks to Professors Lewis, Ariel, and Hummel. Thank you. See you then in a short time.
We should also thank you. This is one person you forgot to thank.
That's okay. It's a pleasure to be here and facilitate this conversation.
Thank you to the organizers as well. The whole system has been brilliantly prepared. I'm very impressed. Very impressed.
You're very much part of this, David.
And David Lemon, I want to thank you for your comments on chat.
Oh,
So you too should be thanked. There are many people to thank.
well, thank you. I think your point about your reminder, because we know that these Christian and Jewish Zionists were contemporary, but you made me realize how important that was. But yeah, I think so. That's, yeah, it seems obvious when you said it, but I hadn't thought about it before, which is the characteristic of true originality. Yeah. Dunque, let's go and have lunch. Okay, bon appetit. Bye.
Yes.
Well,